Hi. I was joking that I feel good today. I don't know why, but I feel very good. In any case, welcome back to a new episode of Africa as a Country Talk, or in short, AIAC Talk. I'm Sean Jacobs. The person on the screen with me is Will Shoki. We are the co-presenters of this Africa as a Country's weekly discussion and interview show. We're taping live. Our producer is Antoinette Engel. She's in Cape Town, South Africa. This is episode 12. I always like to sound like the BBC.
Sounds like Al Jazeera as well.
Yo, let's not get into that. Like how Al Jazeera was actually kind of it's from the South, but in a way it's a clone of the BBC. But let's move on. This is the third episode since our official launch. Please visit our Patreon, patreon.com/Africa as a Country, and watch last week's episode where we revisit the legacy of Kwame Nkrumah. The week before, we talked about Steve Biko, the South African Black consciousness leader. And today, we have a great program for you. First, we ask what the recent political history of Malawi tells us about the future of democracy in Africa. And then we ask, can we broaden what we mean by feminist justice? Our guests are today Jimmy Kainja and Michelle Chikaonda and Sohela Surajpal. But more about them in a few minutes. First, as we do every week, Will, how are you doing?
I'm okay. You know, my mood never really changes. This week I've been feeling a bit under the weather, so my voice is a bit gravelly, so I apologize to our audience for that. It might make me sound a little bit more, I don't know, interesting and mysterious, I'd like to think. But I'm okay. How are you doing?
I'm good. I mean, Liverpool beat Arsenal.
Well, you guys, yeah, I mean, we don't need to get there. We don't need to get there.
We visited last week's debate about decolonial football. I'm very happy. Liverpool, Arsenal. The best African player right now, Sadio Mane, scored.
Sadio.
There's nothing for me to complain about. And just to on that bit, I want to give a shout out to there's a great set of essays on the website actually about kind of the meaning of Sadio Mane that I would recommend people go check out. I think it's called like the making of a footballer or something. But I would recommend that people definitely go look at those essays. In any case, well, let's talk about what's been in the news. And this week, we want to start with something that is not the usual thing we talk about, because you always go for like that heavy political stuff. But we want to talk about this thing called Jerusalema. Now, before we want to start by just showing you what this Jerusalema thing is about. It's a song. It is a beat made by a South African DJ called, I saw someone say the other day, you can't say master, you have to be the decolonial and say master. And we had a singer with him called Nontrebo Zikode, and they made the song, I think right before COVID, but it really picked up during the months of COVID, and it went viral. I mean, you can't turn anywhere, everywhere, and you'll hear this like familiar beat. Everybody's making viral videos. I'm gonna ask Antoinette if she could just play just to give you a flavor of what this is about, and then we'll talk a little bit about the song.
It's a jam. You gotta admit it's a jam. It's a jam. It's a banger. You have to admit that.
Yeah, at a basic level, it's something you can dance to. I think that's the thing that you cannot escape. And it's a very typical. It's kind of a gospel song, right?
Yeah, it's like an interesting house gospel fusion. Even Limpopo House Gospel Fusion, which makes for a soul-catching song.
Right, and the lyrics for anybody who's sort of familiar with it's very typical of a sort of South African gospel song, particularly like the black, if you want, like the black register of gospel songs, Jerusalem, My Home, something about guide me, go with me, protect me. I mean, it's basically that same refrain over and over again. Yeah, it's like I've seen these viral videos, like church ladies like dancing, anywhere from like the local South African church lady to like somebody out in Greece or in Portugal or whatever. And then there's the one I think that started it all was this video of these Angolan kids. I think they called like Phenomenal the Semba from Rwanda, and then they started the whole thing by taking plates of food and like dancing with it and eating while dancing. But in any case, the point of this show is always like we're not always like, oh look, people are dancing, this is interesting. We always ask like, what does this all mean? I mean, not that we should look for meaning in everything.
Yeah, but, we're not here to ruin your fun.
We're not here to ruin your fun. So, I mean, how do you like, just quickly, because we want to get to our guests at some point here. But how do you like when you see something like this? What do you think, Will?
So, I mean, on the one hand, you have to acknowledge just how spontaneous this all was. I mean, Master KG himself in every single interview will always just say how he could have never seen this coming. So as everything that's viral nowadays goes, it just happens out of nowhere. And I think that you can acknowledge the beauty in this sort of spontaneous global phenomenon that everyone chooses to interact in. And you can say it's a wonderful thing to bear witness to. And then you see in South Africa, as has started happening in recent weeks, the government effectively trying to appropriate this dance challenge as this sort of nation building moment, which just feels like a very convenient way to try and distract from a lot of the issues that we're facing now. And I mean, people should and everyone yearns for something light and something nice to make you feel better about the way things are. But once the state starts trying to take control of this whole thing, and as you saw in the video that Antoinette played, telling cops and soldiers and government departments to record this video, then you can start getting questionable.
Yeah, I've seen ones like Uganda, prisons, Kenya, police. The one we had, I think, was Tshwane, which is like the capital of South Africa, like cops from there. So, I mean, I think I tweeted like in the week where I was like, I've been dancing to Jerusalem for a while.
Same here.
I like that South African style house, like not all the house, the more like sort of Quaker house. But I went kind of like the moment I was like, what's the police? I mean, this is the police that people were looking for some kind of hope during these COVID months in those, particularly in Kenya and South Africa, were quite extreme, their police, in the way that they reacted to just people walking out the house, sitting in front of the house, people got killed, got like shot for no reason. So it's like, that was kind of jarring to see them also wanting to get in on the Jerusalem thing. I think another one, which we don't have time to unpack, I saw Wits did one too.
Wasn't part of it.
Exactly. I know you were going to like claim now, but the vice chancellor of Wits, Habib, and a bunch of students. I mean, we don't, let's not get into like the politics of like the university and how the university treated the students during, fees must fall, the various kind of strikes over free public education. And here people are dancing together. So specific to South Africa, there is this kind of, because we know where the song comes from, there is this kind of like that push and pull between something that is authentic, that everybody can embrace, and at the same time it being sort of appropriated for another political cause. Michelle, who's going to come on the program later, also reminded us of a telling fact, which is that we've seen this thing go global, and what does global mean? In which you haven't seen any, and I think Antoinette made this point the other day too. Like there's no videos from the U.S.
That's so true. That's so true.
Usually the U.S. makes it. The U.S. makes culture and exports it, and everybody gets on top of it. And yet, strangely, there's no videos coming out of the U.S. now. I don't know how to explain it. It might be the parochialism. It might be that people in the U.S. are really just under stress. like unlike other people, there's no. I mean, I'm around here right now. It doesn't seem like there's any joy here. So it's not coming from the US. But we want to tell people, go look at it. As you know, with these kind of things, in a month's time, nobody's going to talk about Jerusalem. Well, I hope the song goes up. But I think the what's going to happen is the TikTok videos and so is going to dry up, and people are going to move on to something else. Quickly before we move on, I want to give a quick shout out of solidarity to our friends and colleagues at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. I don't know if you've been following that. One of the oldest buildings on the campus, I think it's the administration building. It's called the Ivory Tower. Burned down, and this is a university that is iconic. Started in the 1920s. It has alumni like Ngugi, Nyerere. It was like a very much a regional university. It still is actually, and in fact, I consider it the Makerere Institute for Social Research, which is run by Mahmoud Mamdani, political scientist, as I think probably the best kind of graduate finishing school in Africa right now. So. It's terrible what happened there. I just a quick word on that. There is some fundraising efforts going on. I saw that MasterCard gave the university like $1 million to help rebuild, and I see a comment on Twitter saying that that's about a third of the amount that they need. So that's great. The police are investigating. Nobody's been arrested yet. Lots of people have been questioned. And Ugandan Twitter is funny because it doesn't stop the speculation and the ridicule. And the best one that I saw today was, both on the kind of jokey but also serious side, the journalist Charles Onyango Obo, who tweeted, I think he tweeted a couple of days ago saying, so a friend in Kampala writes me, this Uganda of ours is strange. The police can't snuff out a fire in one building at Makerere University over 2 days, but the same police will beat down 2,000 protesting students in 2 hours and kill 2 for good measure. So, and
then do the Jerusalem challenge.
Then they do there you go. Bring it full circle. In any case, Will, there was another story that captured your attention, right?
Yeah, so I don't know if people saw last week, but the World Health Organization in Africa basically released its preliminary analysis of Africa's COVID-19 performance, and it had a lot of praise for the continent. It concluded basically that Africa has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, mortality rates in the entire world. It's concluded that a good portion of the population has probably reached herd immunity, and our health systems didn't really get overwhelmed, and effectively that Africa was able to weather the storm far better than any other place in the world had been able to. And there's a lot of things which contribute to this as well. I mean, for one, Africa also has really low testing numbers, but it concluded that even with factoring in excessive deaths during this COVID period, it's likely that our mortality rates would remain one of the lowest in the world. And after this was released, a lot of established news agencies and commentators and a lot of the Western commentariats started scratching their heads and were puzzled that the COVID-19 story in Africa, this sort of heart of darkness of the world, if you believe in the stereotypes, could have a COVID success story. So I think it was just extremely revealing of how there was just this expectation, maybe you could call it a desire even, that the worst of COVID-19 would take place in Africa and would ravage through the continent, and the path of destruction would be greatest here. But that wasn't the case, right? And I think a lot of people are frankly disappointed that it's the global north who have the horror stories still. So I think that's something that was basically revealing. But I mean, another thing that I think is also worth underscoring about all of this is that as much as it's the case that the public health crisis wasn't as bad as anticipated, I think the economic crisis, with countries having imposed lockdowns, having acted proactively, but with the economic consequence which we're starting to face up to now, that's still pretty bad. And so on the one hand, I think a lot of people are resentful of Africa having been able to have a public health success story. But on the other hand, it's almost like a kind of perverse relief that it wasn't as bad as it was, because now a lot of the global north can shirk their responsibility of having to support Africa, which a lot of places were saying in the beginning that they were going to do, right? So there's lots of talk about international solidarity in the beginning, about showing up to support different countries, but a lot of that has evaporated.
Right. And I think it's also, they're instead of studying like the factors that may have led to Africa doing better, I for one, I think it has to do with, there's a higher confidence in public authorities, public health authorities that Africans have. I think secondly, most African countries, they actually hire a medical doctor as the health minister. So there's like it's not like here where there's like an ideological battle between the CDC, which is in the US, which is the Center for Disease Control, which is kind of like in an African country, it would be like the medical council. And the health secretary and the president. In most African countries, the president appoints to his cabinet an actual medical doctor to act as health secretary, and that and then there's a reverence to science that I think you find missing in many other places. Of course, we don't want to overgeneralize. We're talking about different countries. We're talking about systems. The debate even came up about whether authoritarian systems. I know it's a very controversial debate. But the authoritarian systems are apparently better suited. I think at some point there was a lot of this kind of writing because China can actually execute a lockdown. Whereas in America, someone's like, I'm not wearing a mask. You're not telling me. So all these kind of debates, there's been very little of that. And then I think for me personally, for example, looking at other cases like Vietnam, I for one would advise Africans to look elsewhere. We should look elsewhere.
Caroline, India.
We should
lots of these places in the South, yeah.
Yeah, so enough of death cults. We know who we're talking about. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and on our website, africasaCountry.com. And all our work is published under a Creative Commons license. So feel free to repost it, to translate it on your various different websites. At the same time, also remember, if you have questions for our guests, please put them in the chat on Facebook, YouTube, or in the thread on the live stream. Now, on to our first topic. So today, for our first topic, we want to talk about what Malawi can teach us about the future of democracy. And we have two guests with us today. We have two guests who are going to join us for this discussion. They are Michelle Chikaonda, who's a nonfiction writer, born and currently living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but her family originates from Malawi. Her father was a former finance minister, Matthews Chikaonda, and Michelle recently started contributing to Africa as a Country, and we're very excited that she's decided to throw in her lot with us. And you should read her essay, her most recent post or essay that she posted on the site is called it's Our Time to Eat, which is a really beautiful essay, kind of starting with events in Kenya in the 1990s, and then using that as a segue to talk about what is going on currently in Malawi, and kind of speculating and asking questions about the future direction of Malawian politics. Our second guest who's joining us for this discussion is Jimmy Kainja. Jimmy teaches media and communications at the University of Malawi Chancellor College, and he does research into digital cultural politics, communication policy, and freedom of expression. And if you remember, Jimmy, if you Google the website, you'll find that Jimmy has written for Africa as a Country in the past, and you can read his articles. There's a little small archive, and we're hoping Jimmy comes back one day, that you can read some of the articles that he's written. I would definitely recommend particularly an essay that he wrote about kind of the politics of forgetting in Malawi, about the regime of the influence or the impact. And we're going to get to that as a question on present-day politics in Malawi of the reign of Kambuzu Banda. So just to start us off, and I know Will has a question, I want to ask, just by way of introduction, can you just, for people who don't know and who haven't followed Malawian politics recently, can you summarize events of the last year or so? Just quickly, either one of you start and then the other one just kind of tag team to help us just get a sense of like what is it that's been making things interesting in Malawi in the last year that make people look at Malawi right now? Either of you can.
Yeah, Jimmy, you want to take that one, and then I'll hop in here and there.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks, Sean. I think Malawi has had maybe the most interesting 24 months, perhaps. We had what we may call regular elections in 2019. We vote every 5 years in Malawi, voting for president, members of parliament, and from 2014, including also local councillors. So we voted in May. With the usual processes, all the observers in place, everything seemed fine. But then there was a lot of notable irregularities that were happening, and there were a lot of misgivings, especially from the opposition after the announcement of the results. So the Electoral Commission, I think they have 8 days to announce the results after the polling stations have been closed. So following the announcement, the opposition parties, two main opposition parties went to court to complain about irregularities, and a constitutional court was set. Malawi doesn't really have constitutional court, so this was set up specifically for this case, so it was sitting at high court level. It took about 8-9 months of deliberations and a lot of protests in between that civil society organizations and ordinary Malawians really that were not happy with the process had been protesting, demanding that the chairperson of the electoral body, Janasa, stand down for her part in the political, what we may call political mess. She insisted she was not standing down until the court ruling. So most of the demonstrations was about that at the time when the court proceedings were also taking place. So on 3rd February 2020, after about 9 months, I think, the court ruled that indeed there were irregularities with the elections. The irregularities basically could have contributed to the outcome of this or the elections. So the key issues, the elections were annulled, and we were given 50 days. So the electoral board were given 50 days, 150 days rather, to organize new elections. At which point the electoral body and then the ruling party, the DBP under Peter Mutharika's leadership, decided that they were going to appeal. That appeal came as a surprise to many, especially the involvement of Malawi Electoral Commission, because it really had no case. I mean, this had nothing to do with interests of Malawians. But that's what happens. Mutharika himself called the ruling a travesty of justice. Nonetheless, the Electoral Commission chair, Janasa, never stood down, said because they were appealing, so they wait for the outcome of the appeal. So there had been a lot of uncertainties. We were waiting for new elections, and then you still have the same electoral body that messed up in place. So after the ruling at the Supreme Court, which upheld the Constitutional Court ruling, Janasa went, and then ironically, the person responsible for appointing the new chairperson, as well as members, the court commissioners of the Electoral Commission, was the president, who was also an interested party because he was a candidate in the coming elections. So the appointments were done. I think at that point, almost every Malawian just wanted to move on and vote. You must also have this in mind that in between those elections, in between the arguments in court, the protests, what also happened is that in the midst of it, we had the pandemic now. Some other countries have cancelled elections. There were a lot of restrictions that had to come in. But in Malawi, we had to make serious choices, because after the ruling of 3rd March, in which the elections were annulled, the president, the then sitting president Mutharika, had lost legitimacy. He wasn't the right person basically to deal with COVID-19. So the choice was, do you then go on and vote and have a new president that maybe may have legitimacy and perhaps a bit more leeway to make decisions about COVID-19? Or do you postpone the election until COVID-19 is over, then you can vote? In which case, the chances are the sitting president may not have the powers to make decisions. And I think this is what happened. Now, the most interesting thing, I think, internationally for the second elections is that we did not have this time around international electoral observers. These were allowed in 2019. They gave the whole vote, basically, the Green Bill, including SADC, including Commonwealth, EU, all of them said the elections, the usual script, they were free and fair. And they went. The courts disagreed, just as many Malawians who went on the street and protested disagreed. This time around, it would have been interesting if we didn't have COVID-19, if these guys were coming back. But it was easier for them to say, we're not coming this time around because there are no flights and so on and so forth. But almost every Malawian was a monitor this time around. A lot of people actually volunteered, using their own resources, making sure that the elections this time around were going to be, if not free and fair, at least much better from previous time. It was funny when the flight carrying the ballots, I think the ballots were printed in Qatar, was coming to Malawi. That day, actually, there's almost a minute-by-minute update on Facebook and Twitter about whereabouts of the flight. Until the flight landed, it didn't be longer. So the monitoring actually started in Qatar. So it was that sort of moment whereby everybody, I think almost every Malawian, decided, you know what, if we went to sort out this country, we can only do it ourselves, and we need to be serious about these elections. Because if these elections were also messed up and we were in a deep mess, basically. So this is the environment in which we managed to do this. I think what's most interesting also is because I think nobody gave us a chance, including our fellow Africans. Nobody gave us a chance. And I think that's what has made it even more interesting. Locally, I think this has been maybe good for Malawi that because the ruling of the Supreme Court ruling, one of the key issues also that came out of that was the reinterpretation of what it means by majority. So since return to democracy in 1994 in Malawi, we meant to understood that by majority we mean first past the post. So we've had presidents like Mutharika in 2014 only had 35% of the vote, but it was declared winner on the basis that the second candidate had 27%, I think. So this time around, the court said no. Majority means the person who wins has to get at least over 50% of the vote. So it meant that also the ruling said only candidates who had competed in the 2019 elections were eligible for 2020 fresh elections. So it meant that the three top candidates, if you may put it that way, none of them was going to get the 50%. So any coalition between, say, the second and the third candidate, which is what happened in this case, had a better chance of winning. And exactly that's what happened. So for the first time in Malawi, we have what you may call a ruling coalition, because basically it's a coalition of political parties. About 9 of them, including just Bandas, but most of them are really junior parties. The main ones are Malawi Congress Party, MCP, Lazarus Chakwera, and then Saulos Chilima's UTM. So it's almost like Chilima and Chakwera in charge together, almost in equal terms, because everybody feels they have contributed to the outcome of the elections. Unlike before, when in Malawi, almost every president has fallen out of the vice president, basically because the vice presidents have just been handpicked, almost like, okay, I like you, you can be my vice president, and therefore you have to listen to what I'm saying. But this time around, I think there's a better bargaining between those two. So maybe we could have a bit more sensible leadership up there than any time before. I think I can stop there for now, and maybe Michelle will add.
Yeah, no, I mean, you gave a perfect overview. I think what's interesting for me is that, and can you all hear me okay?
You have some reverb.
A bit of an echo.
Yeah, you have an echo, yeah.
Let me try this. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, there you go. Perfect. Yeah.
so I think for me, what's interesting is that my family came back at the dawn of democracy in 1994, and so for me, this is an interesting narrative arc. As you said, I am a nonfiction writer, and so I think watching Malawi, Jimmy gave this fantastic overview from the, like the real strong beats of it, and that's why I'm so glad that he was the one to describe it. For me, I'm looking at this in terms of Malawi's history, the story that we tell ourselves about who we are, who we've been, and what we're going to do, and so watching this happen now, when my family moved back to Malawi, very specifically at the dawn of this very hopeful democracy, and then watching all the ways in which, honestly, some of the democratic process was subverted time and time again. I will be honest that I was one of the pessimists, when people first started challenging this elections, I guess almost a year and a half ago now, I was skeptical. I think there's often this case of, oh man, we're going to do the same thing over. And to really see folks really insist that our turn to democracy now, 26 years ago, really, really means something. I think that was what was quite powerful to watch, essentially, that us, Malawians so insistently, there's a part where you're rewriting the narrative, and there's a part where you're insisting that the narrative we started talking about, now nearly 30 years ago, actually, when they first had the referendum that essentially brought an end to Kamuzu Banda's reign, really insisting that no, we are going to continue with this, it was just remarkable to watch. So we've been talking about the mood at home. I think that folks are hopeful. The fact that so many came together to vote, to insist on voting, even in the midst of a pandemic, and then to insist on their voices being heard. I do think that hope is carrying on with a healthy dose of cynicism. We talk about Malawi, of course, in this African setting, where there's so many stories of hopes brought up and then crushed, and so what that means, what that means for us. So for now, I would say that folks are still, my sense of it, and Jimmy, you may feel free to contradict me entirely. Folks are still somewhat hopeful that this can work. And I think in particular, Jimmy points to the powerful fact of a president and a vice president who are distinctly, very publicly working together rather than quickly becoming adversaries, which is a different story outright for us.
So, one thing I'm wondering now is, Michelle, you expressed just now that you were a bit of a pessimist about things. Jimmy, you were saying earlier that a lot of people had written off whether or not Malawi could come out of this election on a hopeful outcome. I'm wondering what was so special about this year. So, what was so special about the elections and how they were conducted? And despite Malawi having made a democratic turn for 30 years now, you were saying, Michelle, what was it about this year that gave Malawians the sense that our democracy has to come into its own now? Our democracy has to come into maturity, and we as Malawians are capable of doing that by ourselves. It's a fascinating sight, Jimmy, that you're describing, that people are tracking the ballots arriving from Qatar into Malawi and giving live updates to that. What was it about this year that made people determined for this election to be free, fair, participatory, and truly democratic?
Oh, you want to take that one? I'll answer it too. I have my own thoughts about it again.
Sure, go ahead.
So my sense of it is that what might have been different this year. So when Jimmy's talking about hand picking, a lot of our presidents have also hand-picked their successors, So we had Bakili Muzi, who was our first democratically elected president in 1994. He led for 2 terms, attempted to first change the laws so that he could have unlimited rule. Then that failed, changed it again for a 3rd term. This is a very common story across the continent. And so he then picked Bingu wa Mutharika, who then became the president in 2004. Then Bingu ruled for 1.5 terms. He passed away. Joyce Banda came in for a couple of years, and then Bingu's brother took over. So my thought is honestly that folks saw this in a way a 25-year unbroken arc of the same people leading. Kamuzu Banda's reign was 30 years. So at that point, are we really so different? We say that we're a democracy now, but essentially the same people have been there for 25 years. So I think there's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. I think the second thing is that, things just really were insistently not improving. So we got hit in March 2019 by the edge of hurricane, or actually we did get hit by Tropical Storm Idai. And I was actually at home at the time, beginning to, help my mother, reconciling my father's estate. And I remember in that moment, because often it's we're the last ones to hear things. So all that happened was that the electricity got cut and there was a lot of rain. And we were like, guys, this much rain in March, this is unusual. And we heard after the fact that actually this was a tropical storm that had hit us. There was so much that was destroyed. There were roads that were washed away, roads, bridges, infrastructure, really badly hit. And then many months later, there's nothing that's changed, but you can see this now physically in the environment, that things are degraded. And so I think a lot of people saw that, Mutharika, elected in 2019, said, so it's going to be more of the same. And I think people were just tired. We have, almost daily electricity cuts. I know in South Africa, it's a very familiar story. ESCOM is always a problem. There's, hospitals are insistently without medication. People are dying of things that they would never die of in a halfway resourced environment. And so I think people were just tired, and whether or not there was, full on evidence that it's going to be better for this time around with the Tonse Alliance, it's certainly, we know that it won't be at least what it's been. So.
Just quickly before you answer, Jimmy, the other part of this is, thanks, Michelle. The other part of this is this is an election in which there were no foreign observers.
Yeah.
There was a rejection of the idea of we need these people to help us run an election, because you pointed that to the previous election, the Mutharika, when he basically stole the election. Foreign observers declared it free and fair. So is that also part of this story of we want something different, but we also want to change the rules of how we run an election?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think so. So there's this question of, democracy, right? I live in the US now, and there's these ongoing really complicated discussions of when the US imposes freedom on places, what do they really mean? And what these other countries tell us, okay, this is how you need to rule yourselves now. So I think that, there's a huge part of that now Malawians are saying, really, we've got this, we made the decision in that referendum almost 30 years ago, and we are now going to do this for ourselves. We don't have to wait for an outside observers to give us permission to enforce the democracy that we actually really do want. It's not something that was that was given to us. Jimmy, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I agree with you. And also, in addition to that, I think what came out clearly of the 2019 elections was the fact that the people who could have known better, basically, were not interested in participating in political affairs. So, for example, a lot of ballot sheets that had been destroyed, a lot of Tipex that was used, and all that, much of it basically came down to the fact that we had some illiterate people who were basically being used as monitors, people who couldn't do basic mathematics, for example. So this time around, a lot of people realized that, we can't just be criticizing monitors for not doing their job. Why can I not go and do myself? So a lot of people, I know, for example, from Chancellor College, a good number of people actually volunteered either as monitors or to go and actually work as on ballots themselves. So that was the first thing. But also, the second issue this time around, I think, it's also the aspect of trust. I think this is something that has happened because, for the first time, even before 2 days before the announcement of the elections results, electoral results, we knew actually who had won. We knew the figures because this time around, say for example, from where I voted, Chilunga Ward, about 500 of us. By the end of that day, we knew who had won from that ballot center because the votes were counted there. Okay, and then by the time all the votes have been transferred, people were able basically to calculate across the country who has got what vote where and all that. So all these things were possible because in most cases we had people who became aware after 2019 that if you want things to be done, you have to get involved. You can't just wait for other people to do things for you. That's the first thing. But also the second, I also agree with what Michelle was saying, in particular about the type of leadership that we've had since Muluzi. You can take out just Banda. I mean, she was completing a term in which she was a vice president after Bingo's death. But really, it's been Muluzi, Mutalika. And this time around, the second Mutalika decided to have a Muluzi son as a running mate. I mean, that was a very difficult ticket to sell. And it's just a different country now, Malawi. And, I mean, it was just a joke. And to speak about electoral observers, I would have been very, very interested if there was no COVID, if these guys were coming back to monitor the 2020 elections. It would be interesting to see the next elections because, at least among my circles, I don't think anyone is really interested in having electoral observers or monitors because we're able to monitor ourselves. I'm just hoping this is something that we're going to be doing all along because, I mean, if you've done it this time around, under very difficult circumstances, basically, and managed to do it. And also, we know that electoral observers, now we know that actually they come, in most cases, just to rubber stamp the status quo. And this is a problem that we have in most cases because, as for example, SADC, President Baker was here, we're signing their forms, agreeing everything is fine and all that. At that point, Malawi Congress Party had already gone to court lodging complaints. None of these complaints came out from the reports. A week before the announcement before the court ruling in February, EU actually were coming to Malawi to say they're coming to present their electoral findings, saying what they had said initially was these were just preliminary findings, so we're going to come and present this. Actually, they came to Malawi and they did not present that after politicians refused to meet them. So the opposition refused to meet the EU. So I think there's been a lot of lessons, not just for Malawi, but across Africa as well, as to what is the law of international observers. What can you do yourself as citizens? I think.
Yeah, I have a question quickly. It relates to I think we have a little problem there with Jimmy, but hopefully he'll come back.
Yeah.
I think the name Kamuzu Banda has been coming up a lot, right, in this discussion. What I find interesting is that the party that's back in power happens to be the Malawi Congress Party, which is Banda's party. Yeah. And I'm also that's one part of it, and then the second part is that Saulos Chilima was the vice president of the guy who's now out of power. Yes. And now he's the vice president, given what Jimmy just said about what Bingo pulled off, or I think what people tried to pull off. How do you make how do you square this with this is something different? This is something new.
So I think that's a fascinating question because it's almost that so what I have found fascinating, for example, is that it is not only is this is the former dictator's party. A lot of the insignia, the symbolism and everything is directly hearkening to him. The chitenjes, like the wrappers that people are wearing, with his face on it. So it's interesting because you know, I remember growing up hearing people would often say, you know, we, on the one hand we have democracy, on the other hand, at least, you know, we still had lights on the airport road, you know. And so there's this interesting thing of people saying, at least under Kamuzu, like there was order, the roads were done, there was electricity, you know, we didn't have to worry about electricity cuts. And so there's this interesting thing where people are, I think, like cherry picking what perhaps was what they're remembering as the best parts. I think you talked earlier about like this question of forgetting, which I think is really fascinating and honestly a bit problematic. That's an understatement in Malawi, like forgetting really the dark sides to this, to, you know, those 30 years. I wonder with Saulos Chilima if it's another way of like rewriting the script, because you're right, he was Mutharika's vice president, and they followed the old script of, you know, Mutharika trying to throw him out, and he started his own party. That is how Mutharika's party started. Mutharika, you know, that he, not quite that he was Muluzi's vice president, but that in order to separate himself from Muluzi's legacy, he started his own party, the DPP, the Democratic People's Party. And so I wonder if they are deliberately trying to say we're not going to like lash ourselves to that same sort of like consternation that we know happens honestly within the first year or two of a presidential term in Malawi. You know, the vice president and vice inevitably like separating, you know, with the vice eventually maybe even ending up persecuted, thrown in jail or exiled. That happened with Chilumpa, that happened with Joyce Banda, you know, that maybe they're really trying to say we are, as leaders, and I wonder what those conversations were like, we are co-signing the rewriting of this narrative, you know, that we are, you know, part of Malawi being a stable environment in which things can finally become better is the president and vice actually working as a team, you know. And so I think it's very powerful that, you know, especially with Chilima, because originally, of course, he was running as the presidential candidate, and for him to decide to step back and say, let me, you know, there's obviously, you know, complicated, you know, political, you know, regional, everything like politics around it. For him to ultimately decide to say, you know, we're in this together, you know, Ponce Alliance, we're all together, you know, was critical, I think, in terms of like Malawians seeing that and understanding that sometimes it's not about what you want, but it really is about what we are going for in a larger sense.
Jimmy, I know you got cut off, but just quickly, because we're running against time. The question was just there's the fact that this is Banda's party that's back in power. That Banda looms large in the history of Malawi, and here Banda's party is back. And then the second part of it is Saulos. He was the vice president of Mutharika, and now he's the one who we assume is gonna, as Michelle says with reference to narrative, he's now gonna help write this new narrative. Like, how does one square that circle? Like, let's start that circle. How does this make sense? Yeah.
I think the most important thing here to remember is that these two belong to two political parties. We don't know how strong, for example, Mutharika's party is going to be in the next elections. If the party is weakened, then we could literally say that in 2024 we have Chilima and Mutharika, in which case Chilima might decide to contest against Mutharika, against Chakwera, given what happens in between. But another thing is we don't know the agreement that was made, because these guys had to sign an agreement before the electoral alliance. Chilima is only 46, I think, this year. He could well give himself 10 years as a vice president for Chakwera and then take over after 10 years. We don't know. And that is going to be interesting, but I think it may be beneficial to Malawi, because it's so clearly out there that Chilima's ambition is to become a president of this country one day. So he's not really going to let things get out of hand, or in other words, it's not going to mess up, because he's going to be just basically making his own CV worse. So I think it's so difficult to tell now, but MCP has grassroots in Malawi, and I think that's one reason that MCP has survived so long in the opposition. I don't think there will be any other political party that can survive that long in the opposition. So MCP will be there. I don't know what MCP constitution says, but Chakwera has been a president of the MCP since 2014. Is he still eligible to lead the party? I don't know. I just don't like the situation in which the UTM collapses into MCP, in which case we are going back to one-party system because we don't have opposition. And I hope Chirima's UTM really stand out, and perhaps you can have opposition one day. Because, for example, now we have by-elections for I think 3 constituencies and some wards. I think in November. At the moment, it's clearly that Chilima's party is campaigning for their own MPs. MCP is also campaigning for their own MPs, and I think that can only be good for Malawi. But what future holds between those two, I think it depends on what they agreed. If they are going to honor those agreements, and maybe with time we might be able to know. Mind you, it's only about now, just about 3 months in power, so it's too early. It's too early. Yeah.
It's still happening.
So I think that
time. Yeah.
I think that naturally brings us to maybe a final question to ask, which is about Lazarus Chakwera. You know, what's this guy's deal? So he's a pastor, and what are his economic and social policies? Something that he preaches a lot about is self-reliance, and how I think actually Malawians have demonstrated their self-reliance in this election cycle. But how does he intend to realize that at the level of the economic and the social, in spite of the fact that I think at this time, a lot of Malawi's governmental budget is still dependent on foreign aid. So what's his vision for the country? What does he hope to give to Malawians? And how do we make sense of his identity as a theologian and a pastor, if that's relevant at all?
Before you answer, I did see comments where he said, almost to the extent like, this is like my flock. This is like, he thinks of the citizenry as his church. So, I mean, the citizenry contains people that want to start their own church, or that will disagree with you, pastor, and you say, but the Bible says whatever. So, like, how would this work? Like, I mean, what can we get from this? Is it this empty change, or will this guy surprise us? Because, I mean, I know in the neighbors, Zambians will tell you, we tried that. We had people who profess to be particularly like heavy with the pastors. We have people who became pastors, like what was his name, Chiluba. So how does this play out? Like, how do you guys view him as a leader?
Do you want to go first, Michelle?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I find it fascinating. So Malawi is a very intensely religious country, very, quite, conservative in many ways. And so, Chakwera's choices, like word choices of like the flock, is very deliberate. It's interesting. Some might say megalomaniac, but very interesting way of aligning himself. Jesus talks a lot about, all the time in the New Testament and the Gospels, like about his flock. Specifically, talking about going to, bring lost sheep back into it and everything like that. So I think he's hearkening to that imagery to say that I am here to take care of you. I don't yet believe, again, as Jimmy said, it's just been 3 months. I don't yet believe that it is he is now like, a sort of elevating himself to be a godlike figure. I call me again and we can have this conversation again in 3 years. But I do think that he is absolutely, because so much of Malawi does know, if they don't know the Bible itself well and not themselves able to read it, they certainly, people who are very religious, go to church, fervently, are, and are very intimately, that understanding of your relationship to a larger figure taking care of you is just woven into everyday life. And I think that's what he's getting at. So in terms of his, economic and social policies, I read his State of the Nation address from, I guess almost 4 weeks ago. And I will say that it sounds great. It sounds super, it sounds ambitious. He sounds certainly determined. But the essay in which I talk about the lessons learned from Kenya, and that the book, it's our turn to eat. I think we do have, there's always a lot of talk, and now seeing not just the, we need to wait to see the action. I am optimistic. I think that the way that they have positioned themselves, they are making it clear that we are different to the people who come in and just sit. But we'll have to give them time to see, because of course we know that it's very easy once you get in there. There's, as much as they have changed this moment, 2019, 2020, the reality is that these institutions that they are leading are very much entrenched. The ways of doing business, the ways that people come into power and are ejected from power, and that's actually what I think is going to be the thing that has to change in order even to begin to promote these social economic programs that would hopefully, ameliorate Malawi permanently for the better. So,
Jimmy?
Yeah.
Yes, I agree with Michelle, especially on the economic front, and we'll see. I'm a bit more optimistic, at least from the tone. But one other thing that I know also, I don't think he's going to do as worse as where we're coming from the past 5 years. I think that can also give people some hope. You mentioned about his background as a pastor, religious person, and all that. Yes, he's actually said a lot of things that points to that. I would want to believe maybe his questions will not let him actually think of Malawi as a church of some sort, one way or the other. But I think references to religious issues, I think those will come because this is what he's done almost all his entire career. And as he speaks in the public, I expect to hear that for that reason. But also, I think for most part of our democracy in Malawi, we've had this narrative of looking at the president like the father of the nation. We have just Banda called Amai, basically meaning a mother. So I think coming from that background that people tend to look at elected leaders basically as sort of statesmen or elder people in the villages reading the whole village. So that sort of thinking. So I think from that thinking that we can call somebody father of the nation, it's easier that people can accept somebody, thinking of you as, their frog and whatnot. We know that has its problems. But if Chakwera is to think of himself as a leader he was for church, because people in church obviously the conservative places don't ask questions and whatnot. But if he wants to do that, and I think he's mistaken. Malawi is a different place now. People are not going to accept that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both of you for being on the show today. That was really comprehensive, and hopefully we'll look forward to your return. And I think Sean should hope to have some Malawian observers at America's elections next month.
Volunteers.
Michelle is there.
My mother has been, I was speaking with her a few days ago, and I said, you remember what Dad used to say about how, if the military is on the side of the people, then it's unlikely there's going to be a coup. And she said, this is so strange that you're talking about the U.S. like this, because these are thinking right now. And Malawi training is very informative here. I've already been telling my friends, listen, if you don't want to get caught up, make sure to have a bunch of supplies at home. Hey, just you just stay at home for a month. You don't want to get caught up. So I'll be glad to be an observer here, and we'll see what happens.
Please, for Sean's sake, for both of your sakes. Thank you so much, Jimmy, Michelle. Really all. Appreciate your time.
Great meeting. Yeah, great talking with you. Yeah.
All right. Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you once again to Michelle and Jimmy. And moving on to our final segment of the show, we are going to be joined by Sohela Surajpal. Sohela is completing her LLM at the University of Pretoria in South Africa's Center for Human Rights, writing her dissertation on prison abolition in Africa as a decolonial and human rights perspective. Sohela recently wrote an article for us, it's absolutely fantastic, called "Carceral Feminism is Not the Answer. We need to reimagine our conceptions of feminist justice in South Africa, and putting people in cages is not the answer." Now, both South Africa and the continent have exceedingly high rates of gender-based violence. South Africans have, for the last few months, engaged in cycles of protest, calling for the state to do more to tackle gender-based violence, and including very recently during the COVID lockdown. And for most people, the intuitive way of thinking about how to address this is at the level of the criminal justice system. So the police should make more arrests, the courts should make more convictions, and people should be sentenced for longer. So Sohela, it's great to have you here. And could you perhaps begin by telling us, when you wrote this article, what led you to being suspicious of this orthodoxy and how people think of how to address high rates of gender-based violence?
Yeah, so, I think when I started considering myself a feminist, which was, pretty much the moment I knew what that word meant, it's very easy to get, caught up in a very, I guess, liberal conception of feminism, which is the type of feminism that is okay, essentially, with the status quo, so long as the status quo has more women in positions of power, has less violence against women. And that's a type of feminism that I think is tailored to be that way, so that it appeals a little more to people who are moderate, who are liberal, who are even a little conservative. And so it has value, I guess, in that sense. But the unfortunate part comes about in the sense that it then coexists quite peacefully with carceral logics, things like prisons and police. And it was only, I think, when I started to become a little more suspicious of, I guess, more liberal worldviews and started to become a little more leftist that I started to think very deeply about the role that prisons play, the role that the police play in our societies. It's not, I think, difficult to reach that level of questioning in South Africa, which generally, as a country, views the police with a lot of suspicion. Most South Africans will tell you that their interactions with the police are disappointing, if not horrible, right? So, best case scenario is that the police have taken 3 hours to respond to your call. Worst case scenario is that you are a student or an activist or just a poor everyday person who has been actively terrorized by the police. And so, you start to ask yourself, how are these the people who we as feminists, who are supposed to be against forms of domination and oppression, how are these the people that we go to when we need help? And I think, at the very same time that we have South African feminists calling for more punitive carceral responses to gender-based violence, on the very same platforms, we have South African feminists who are talking about how, you go to the police to report an instance of gender-based violence, of rape, and you get laughed at. You get told to go back home to sort it out as a family matter. Just before the article was published, but a little after I'd started writing it, there was a massive march coordinated by students in various parts of South Africa against gender-based violence, calling on the state to act. And the police came out and started tear gassing and shooting at protesters, which is really, I think, the only illustration you really need about where the political will of the police lies and what they see their purpose as. And that is not to protect the women who are protesting because they are being murdered and raped, but to terrorize them, to make sure that they go back home and keep quiet.
Can you just step a little back? Can you just, for people who don't know, because we're speaking specifically about South Africa, that has very radical political traditions. We assume that. So with the feminist movement, because can you just explain, like, sort of like you know, obviously you sort of reflecting, I think, a break, like, and can you just unpack that a bit for somebody who like looks at South Africa and thinks South Africa has this like mass movement, it has the ANC. The ANC had a women's movement, which was the Women's League, and sort of connected to that were other organizations, you know, were not necessarily ANC, but they were aligned with the ANC's political leadership. And then there's also something else that happened, which was more recently, 2015, 2017. I mean, we always come back to this moment of young people on campuses. Is that where we begin to see this kind of break about how do we think about feminist justice, about, you know, cultural feminism? Can you just like unpack that a little bit for someone who doesn't know, you know, what feminism looks like in South Africa now?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. Because there are obviously, you know, so many different forms of feminism. A legal scholar I really look up to describe South Africa as a bifurcated society where, you know, you have a certain group of South Africans who live in a world of human rights and constitutionalism, and then you have another group of South Africans whose interactions with the law and with the state and just in general is one that is still very much, he calls it neo-apartheid, still very much one of oppression and subjugation. But I mean, yeah, you point out that South Africa has quite a great history of women's movements, from, you know, as far back as anti-apartheid movements, as anti-colonial movements. We've had women who have been at the very forefront of the liberation struggle and of mass people's movements, and that hasn't changed. So you refer to Fees Must Fall, and I guess the preceding protests, which were Roads Must Fall, which were all about the excessive fees being charged to access tertiary education, as well as like colonial imagery on university campuses, in university syllabuses. And one of the concerns that arose during those protests specifically were concerns from women and from queer people who felt as though even within what was a very sort of revolutionary movement, student revolutionary movement, there was still excessive amounts of misogyny, of gendered violence perpetrated by both the police and by students and activists. So, you know, I think any South African will know that protests against gender-based violence are not something new. We have them like regularly, annually almost, and unfortunately they don't seem to change much. So I wouldn't say that this is a moment of rupture actually, or a break really from the status quo. In many ways, as much as the protests after the horrible thing that happened to Uyinene when she was killed and raped in a post office were different maybe in the scale, they weren't different in terms of like an event or a specific demand. Protests of a similar sort, but maybe less in scale, had been happening. And so I think the rupture that happens is more as we see things happening in the US and protests against Black Lives Matter this time around being framed in a very abolitionist way, in a way that says that this isn't terrible just because, you know, of a specific bad policeman, but because of an entire system that is rotten, that is inherently racist, inherently violent. That is to a certain extent spilled over, I think, into South Africa. And we're starting to see, I think, more people now think very critically about the police and about prisons, which is great because, I mean, you know, prisons in South Africa were very much colonial imports and served very nicely the aims of colonists, as did the police. But it's definitely not a mainstream view, and I think part of the reason abolitionism is struggling a little in South Africa is because of our horrible rates of gender-based violence. I mean, in any conversation about abolitionism, you're going to have people, one of the first questions that people will ask is, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? And in a country where something like 7 women and 3 children are killed every day, that's not even to speak yet about rape and sexual assault, that question becomes a very compelling one and a very compelling argument. So I wouldn't, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't call this a rupture so much as something a few fringe people are starting to ask in the face of a mass movement that is still very much centered in carceral demands.
Just before, I know Will wants to ask a question, but just to follow up on something you just said, and I know we were going to ask this later, but you brought up this the fact that the prison abolitionist framework struggles in places like South Africa. So what is, like, what are you kind of arguing to get people onto your side? Like, how are you going to convince them? Because it sounds, I mean, the point I brought up the ANC, because I think I read something the other day. It was a very kind of trite comment, but I think it's very powerful. We fail to recognize how powerful the ANC, and to borrow something from Michelle, like the ANC's narrative of what is wrong in South Africa and how to make it right. So if the ANC is on the, like, send them to jail, lock them up thing, you know, Becky Cele as like the embodiment of that. While it doesn't, you know, when its own kind of a minister beats up a woman or whatever, they do nothing. He's still having parties and blah, blah. But how do you, like, what's the work like that has to be done to, like, get people to change, for change to happen around people coming on board with the prison abolitionist framework in a place like South Africa? Because in your article you talk about how the jails in South Africa is essentially like just to, like, you know, it's a finishing school and a recruitment for more violent gangs. So like, what is this work that I mean, I don't want to make it your job, but that has to be done to get people onto this.
Yeah.
It's a hard argument. You're right. It's a very hard argument to make in South Africa, to tell people prisons are not the answer.
So, you know, an interesting story maybe to start with is that I started writing my dissertation. I picked the topic at sort of the very beginning of the year, end of last year. And at the time, I thought, you know, this isn't something that's going to take off in South Africa anytime soon. It's barely even taken off in the States, which is where so many of the great, like, abolitionist thinkers are based or have been from. And so I sort of thought of myself as like, yeah, this isn't going to be mainstream, but it's something that I think is important and that I'm interested in. And hopefully it's a contribution that I can make to starting that conversation. And then we have what happens to George Floyd, and we have the protests in the US, and there's almost like an explosion of talk about defunding or abolishing the police and prisons. And I was just, I mean, so it was wonderful, but it was also so surprising. I think people just really exceeded my expectations. And so, you know, in South Africa recently, so I know there are groups of students that are advocating for abolishing the police and prisons. Is a really cool group called Cops or Flops that does, interesting name, but they do some really cool work, at least around spreading awareness and starting that conversation. But at, I guess, a more social movement space, recently a group of activists in Cape Town, and I mean like quite a large group of a coalition of many different groups that work on the ground, released a letter that explicitly demanded the abolition of one of the city of Cape Town's law enforcement units because of the role that law enforcement plays, especially in the city of Cape Town, in evicting the poor. And so this was a demand that came, you know, from the ground, not from someone in an Ivy League tower somewhere at UCT, but from poor people, working class people, homeless people, and activist groups that they have formed and that they work with. So I think that the first point I want to raise is, yes, it is a difficult country to speak about abolition in, considering, you know, the rates of violent crime that we have. But people are surprisingly more open to this than we would think often. And once presented with these ideas, are very eager to engage and often to climb onto that train. And the second thing I want to say then is that as much as we do have a problem with violent crime, we also have a problem with an incredibly inefficient police force, or at least a selectively efficient police force, right? So something I mentioned in my article is that the police are completely unable to deal with rape and sexual assault, but they are very, very efficient at quashing protests and evicting people. And I think that's something that most South Africans know and will intuitively agree with. So I think that's a very good springboard to work off of. And I think it's something that a lot of the mainstream sort of feminist movement now would engage with if presented with those facts and these arguments. The idea that we're calling for the police to be more involved and to be trained better, but here are the facts on how they have consistently failed, and how I think, you know, a slight reframing of abolitionism as not only being about the humanity of perpetrators, but also as being victim centric, as being essentially about how do we ensure that victims have a meaningful form of justice, which is more than just saying your perpetrator maybe in 8.6% of cases will be locked in a cage. So that's, I think, a type of reframing that needs to be done in South Africa, especially. Whereas in the US, you know, you can talk a lot about how a lot of people are convicted on minor drug offenses, and there's a very like racial dynamic. In South Africa, while those definitely are present, we do have to reckon with the slightly often more violent nature of harm that is present. But there's a lot of work there. And the last thing I just want to mention that I think is interesting is one of the techniques, because obviously, you know, the obvious techniques are things like mutual aid programs that people are very willing to buy into and that aren't explicitly abolitionist, but can be made to be or slanted that way, things like spreading awareness. I was doing some research for my dissertation, and in Ghana, I think they at some point had this really interesting program where they would open prisons up for members of the public to visit. And like you would go and do tours of working prisons. And a lot of what they found there, and I mean, this wasn't massively rolled out, but where it was that people were shocked. They were horrified. Prisons are often invisible to us and hidden from us. And that's one of the reasons why they're spaces of such abuse and human rights violations. But where you can actually invite people or in some way make prisons and prisoners' lives more visible, I think a lot of people would intuitively feel like this is not okay. This is not what we think is happening. And I mean, we all know that Pollsmoor and other prisons in South Africa are atrocious, but it's often just an article you read at some point and you quickly dismiss. And I think awareness around those things could be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, what I found really important about your article as well is you emphasized how notions and conceptions of restorative justice are part of South Africa's legal and juridical life. That's a precedent that exists in South Africa. So it's odd that this is something that South Africans struggle to resonate with, considering the fact that how we understand justice is rooted in these conceptions of justice, which make the normative switch of emphasizing how wrongdoing that happens within the community isn't only the problem of the individual wrongdoer, but it is the problem of the community and the conditions that community creates that raises up this individual wrongdoer. And this is something that's rooted in African conceptions of justice and should be articulated as such. So how do we get people to reach that place where we say this isn't something that we're importing from America, but this is something that is foundational to how we as Africans have always conceived of justice. And once we do that, we say, well, once we understand wrongdoing, moving past the level of the individual, we look at their circumstances and their social and economic circumstances and changing their behavior by changing those underlying circumstances.
Yeah, so I mean, great point. One of the questions I always get whenever I'm speaking about abolition is like, or at least the comments that I get is, yeah, that's fine if you're a professor or if you're in one of these Nordic or Western countries, but how does that apply to us, to us here in South Africa? Like, that's un-African. And it's strange because, as you point out, that's the furthest thing from the truth. So, one of the things I discuss in my dissertation is this idea of prisons, like I said earlier, as colonial imports, but not just as colonial imports, but as integral to upholding the aims of colonialism. So racial superiority, economic exploitation, and just political suppression. I think that it's an interesting question to say, how do we get that to people in general? Something that I think is interesting, because obviously, you know, the average South African is probably not going to read my dissertation, unfortunately.
Oh, probably not.
Yeah.
I've experienced
You know, a lot of South Africans still live under, or to some extent experience, customary law, right? So traditional African law. In KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province that I'm from, large amounts of people may not live permanently in more rural areas, but at least have a home somewhere in rural KZN where they still live to some extent under the jurisdiction of the Zulu king, or under certain headmen. And I'm obviously not making the argument that, you know, these are groups of people who don't experience just general South African law, because they most obviously do. And I'm also not making the argument that customary law is perfect. But, you know, when I studied customary law, which unfortunately is like a single module in the syllabus as a law student, one of the things we learned was that under customary law, rape is not a crime. It is what Western lawyers would consider a delict. So it's a civil claim, right? And at the time we were taught that that was terrible and, like, you know, a really bad way of doing things, because you're essentially claiming damages, and unfortunately it's damages that go to a woman's father very often. And yes, there are concerns there, but I think it is important to note that what that should tell us is that customary law looks at issues of rape or even of violent crimes in a very different way than just general law does. And customary law is a type of law that many people experience on some level in South Africa. And so there's a lot of scope, I think, looking at it through that perspective, to think about how customary law can be developed with the influence of community leaders and traditional leaders, so that it is restorative in nature, which it already is, but, you know, still compliant with, I guess, some of the tenets of our constitution and the dignity of women. And that's something that South African courts have done before, right? When they've interacted with customary law through, for example, inheritance matters and whether or not, you know, men only can inherit or women can. And they've had very progressive judgments, but something that's interesting to note is it hasn't been the court imposing progressiveness onto customary law. It's been a matter of people going to the courts to say, customary law is living, it develops, it has developed in a way that is progressive, but the way it's been codified isn't progressive. And so all we need you as a court to do is recognize the living progressive nature of customary law. And I think that's something that could happen here in terms of the way the customary law thinks about rape and sexual offenses, but also in terms of the way that the law in general interacts with customary law and incorporates it, because unfortunately we have a system in South Africa where we relegate customary law to the sidelines. And so, yeah, like you said, Will, I think more needs to be done by our courts to incorporate, you know, values of Ubuntu and restorative justice into the mainstream, and not just into big constitutional court cases, but in the everyday criminal case.
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, you just mentioned now about how in all of these instances, it's people going to the courts and telling the courts what they want their justice to look like. And I think that if we're thinking about how to build an abolitionist framework in South Africa, it's always about having,
as they say these days.
Sorry?
How to decolonize, as they say these days.
how to decolonize. But on that note, I mean, thank you so much, Sohela. Sean, I don't know if you have anything else to ask or.
No, I actually like how this ended, which is this kind of like, how do you, if we are going to rethink conceptions of justice, then it's easy for us to go, as you said earlier on, like we're going to go read all the American literature. And because that, you know, they're debating it over there and so on. And we joke about this a lot. Will and I, somebody writes something and like, they're quoting like, you know, 3 American authors, and that's great. But you just pointed us to something that it's there already. You have to work there, and like it turns out there is a rich. It's not like Africans were sitting around waiting and waiting for, I don't know whether it was a liberal or whoever to get the conception of something. They had a practice, and we have to think about we have to confront those practices and see like how they can work for us.
Exactly, and we have to read Sohela's dissertation. So when it comes out, please, we'll publish it.
Start with her article on Africa as a country on the website. Start with her article.
Yes.
We're looking forward to you writing more often for us.
Yeah.
No,
please.
I would love to. Definitely.
Excellent.
This has been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for watching. Thank you, Antoinette, our lovely producer, as usual, who has been behind the scenes, making us appear as pretty as we possibly can. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Especially good today. I'm gonna give myself some shouts.
If you do say so yourself.
I look good today. I'm just gonna give myself that. I don't know. I feel like today.
Wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone. And don't forget, we're back every Tuesdays at 6 p.m. South African time, 12 p.m. New York time. Like, subscribe, check out our Patreon.
Let's give a shout out to the Nigerians. 5
p.m. Lagos.
7 p.m. Somebody pointed this out that we should stop doing that thing where we say 12 p.m. Eastern, New York time.
You should stop. You should stop doing that thing.
The last couple of weeks, I've heard all the decolonial, like, going for me. People are gunning for the North. I don't know. I'm from the Cape Flats, bro. I don't know how I keep being part of the North. I'm from the Cape Flats.
The North must shut up, as Grief Chawa said, and we're going to shut up. So thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Last word there from Calvin Souls, who's watching and saying, hear African voices on the abolition of policing. That's a great way to end the show. Anyway, people, see you next week again.